Welcome and good afternoon to our panel on decolonizing environmental movements. This is an interesting panel, I think, because it gets to the heart, potentially, of what this conference is really all about. The idea of taking nature black and creating space where people of color can talk about environment on our own terms, on turf and on domains that are typically identified with whiteness. The idea that the norm in these movements would typically be through the lens of someone who experiences the environment through the experience of having been white in the environment, which doesn't necessarily set the tone for what we as people of color experience in these movements. So telling our stories can be difficult when we're either predefined or where there's a presumption that whiteness is the norm. Drew Lanham, one of our speakers earlier in the week, one of our keynoters, I think probably said it best, that these organizations really have to change if they want to be inclusive. It's that simple, but of course it's also that complicated. The likelihood of these movements changing presents the possibility that we see ourselves in greater focus or more willing to invest ourselves in these movements. But it also changes the status of whites in these movements potentially too, that they get to understand not only us, but themselves much better as well. So there are dividends available to having these safe conversations about how to unpack what we call decolonization. The idea that the prime players get to define the issues, get to lead these movements, get to really set for what's norm. So today we have a panel that consists of non-white conservationists, each of us with very different lived experiences, with very different lenses. We're spread out geographically. I think Lois is in Georgia. Beth is in the UK in London, near London actually, I think. Victoria and I think are in the DC area. But that's the magic of having a virtual conference instead of one that's in person. We can put us all in the same forum. So I'd like to let the panelists introduce themselves and their perspective on this, and then we can open up to a conversation with the audience about how we unpack the colonization, the ideas that exist within these movements, the worldview that exists, that doesn't always favor full participation from people of color. I will say that we talked a little bit before this conference, and I just want to throw some words out. I'm not going to show you the graphics, but we did build word maps when we were talking amongst ourselves, and I'll just throw out some ideas and some words before we do the introductions. The idea of movements that need to be decolonized includes words like silenced, white entitled, unfunded, racism, supremacy, manipulative, dispossessed, passive aggressive, science obsessed, toxic, all sound very scary and negative terms. So to be fair, we'll do the other side of the street. We also came with some positive terms about movements that have been successfully decolonized, what they feel and look like. And those would have words in them like fairness and safe space and telling our stories and equity, reclaiming voices, soulful, accountable, anti-racist, bigger movements, self-definition, equality. You get the idea. I mean, any play we do with words where we're throwing word association out, I'm sure various words would come to various people. But those are some that we came up that are underlying themes in our attempt to deconstruct the idea within at least some movements that whiteness is not only the norm, but the preference. So why don't we start off with Victoria, just because you're the first person that my eye caught when I looked at the screen, if you're comfortable with that. Tell us about yourself, who you are, where you work, where you are, and your perspective on how you fit into this conversation about decolonization.
Thank you. That was a great introduction. Before getting into who I am, I want to thank the Audubon National Society for the invite to be a panelist at the event. For me, the event has been super phenomenal. I mean, it's been like a revival in some ways, and I'm so glad that I got to sit in on a lot of the talks and to be a panelist here. With the Fish and Wildlife Service, we're celebrating 150 years of conservation this year. So I'm extremely pleased to have this opportunity to share my story and a little bit about my experiences. As for an introduction, I'm a second generation special agent with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, currently serving as a special agent for the investigations unit here at headquarters. And in this role, I oversee drafting policy and investigations for the entire program to help with the national sustainability of our program. I started off as a wildlife inspector trainee, and that was a great on-the-job internship program that the Fish and Wildlife Service had. Then I transitioned to becoming a full-time wildlife inspector, then became a special agent in Ohio as well as in Hawaii. And Hawaii was a super magical duty station. I got to learn quite a bit about the cultural significance that nature has. I learned those lessons growing up as a child, but being in Hawaii was extremely magical, learning that, cultural history is built upon natural history. Whenever you have rare and endangered endemic species in Hawaii, such as the Laysan albatross, it's just a special place for any type of conservation work. As far as my personal roots, my roots are rooted in Arkansas. I spent half of my childhood there, as well as in California. So I like to say that I'm a city girl with country roots. So that's just a little bit about me, and I'm looking forward to sharing more as the panel continues.
Lois, do you want to go second? Again, random access here. Tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you fit into this conversation through your lens.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Lois. So we'll start off by talking about my connection to the natural world. So my connection to nature has been heavily influenced by the sort of nomadic lifestyle I had growing up. I grew up with a pianist and composer mother. She sort of went where the wind took her. This meant that I lived in 3 different cities in South Korea: Atlanta, San Diego, California, Los Angeles, Pasadena, South Pasadena, Maryland, before moving back to the South for college. So the positive that came out of this was that I cultivated a deep sense of respect and love for the natural world, like the moons, the trees, the stars, the urban streams, and the birds who were there for me when the built environment and even my friends and family were not. So this upbringing, it helped me to understand and appreciate the connectedness of the natural world and the humankind, leading me to the types of education and professions I've had in my life. So I am an environmental geographer by training, and I currently work as an epidemiologist responding to COVID-19 efforts in Atlanta, Georgia. I am primarily interested in leveraging open source software and data to meet the needs of projects. So as an Asian American environmentalist and activist, I have benefited from the existing systems and institutions whose mission is to protect the natural world and human health. But my experiences also include interactions that have significantly altered my worldviews, specifically the stringent ranking system in which the world, this country, the state I live in, I reside in, thrives off of categorizing and denigrating according to one's skin color, biological sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, place of residence, ethnicity, religion. It became not only case studies I read in textbooks or even folk tales, but realities that I have to face as an Asian American female environmentalist working in the US.
Thank you, I appreciate that. Beth, it's your turn. Tell us where you are. We're all obviously very impressed that you visited us from 5 hours ahead, actually. That's pretty cool.
Evening here. Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm really pleased I can be here with you. My name's Beth Collier. I'm a nature allied psychotherapist and I teach woodland living skills and natural history. I grew up on a small holding in rural countryside in the east of England, which is quite an unusual experience for a Black person in the UK. 98% of the UK Black population lives in cities. So I was lucky enough to have a very immersive childhood, sort of naturally exploring and roaming and learning about the natural world. And as I came to live in cities, seeing levels of disconnect in all populations, but particularly amongst people of colour, and starting to investigate the reasons why. So I've done a lot of ethnographic research looking at people of colour's relationship with nature in the UK, looking at issues of why we're less present in the natural world than white communities, given when in our countries of heritage, we tend to be very deeply connected to the natural world. And the results of that ethnographic research revealing how strongly a factor racism is, either the experience of racism or the fear of encountering racism. And I ran an organisation called Wild in the City, which is aiming to rebuild the oral tradition back into learning about nature within families, within communities, which is the way we would have learned in countries of heritage. And within that work, encountering attitudes and hostilities which suggest this isn't in nature. And if we are in nature, we should really be following and not leading. And that's part of the context in which I'm joining you today.
Fantastic. So before we go to questions, I mean, I think we've established that we do have very different lived experiences, very different reference points, right? Different knowledge base about the things we encounter in nature. I'd be kind of curious to have a sense from any of you that care to respond. What kind of change would be necessary in these movements that we're talking about, these cause movements, that would make them more embracing and more likely to hear our stories? Any thoughts on that?
For me, in the UK context, I think there needs to be acknowledgement that there are different lived experiences and different perspectives. It's something I encounter. The environmental sector here is asking the question, why do we not get Black people, people of colour, coming onto our programmes? And there's an obliviousness as to what our experiences of taking part in those programmes has been. There's very much the view that if Black people aren't in nature, it's because Black people have a problem with nature, rather than that for many people of colour, what we don't like is how we're received by others when we're in these spaces. But there's a framing of the issue that's very white-centric. It's a narrative which doesn't include them being part of the dynamic. It's simply that Black people aren't interested.
Yeah, I've always seen an irony in that myself. Actually, the idea that if we're not interested in these movements, we must not be interested in nature, which is, they're really two different things. I actually have the point of view that the absence of people of color, at least in some of the mainstream big greens, is largely because this is a boycott. That we, as people of color, know where we want to invest our time and energy, where we want to invest ourselves in these organizations. And sometimes being predefined as diversity is not the best offer we've heard. Actually, there are other ways we'd like to define ourselves. And I think that's a transactional conversation that has to occur in these organizations. That's difficult because it does mean realigning the roles that white people play in these organizations too. It doesn't just affect us, it affects everyone in these organizations. And so there's a presumption, I think, sometimes that we're either attacking or not on the right page or off message. I've been accused of being off message simply because I'm not on the message of the white people who run the organization, who funded, who have historically volunteered and participated. So I do think there's that fracture. But I'd love to hear more of your ideas. We do have some questions that are accumulating, but I did want to kind of flesh this out a little bit because it is a difficult subject to talk about, particularly one that's difficult to talk about without giving offense. I think we're trying to make better organizations. I think that's the focus of this conversation. And so I think these groups need our feedback. So
yes, if I may tag along to your discussion.
Yes, absolutely.
On a seemingly nuanced but incredibly pervasive behaviors of kind of colonialist mindsets and white supremacy that exists in these workspaces. It feels as though, where we add value subconsciously to the words, the statements, the research ideas that are generated in work environments, staff meetings, or just conversations in the hallways, they are, from my observation and experiences, they fall pretty heavily on those in the dominant culture in white spaces. That's just kind of my observation. And another thing that I have been thinking about processing was I recognize the incredible amount of burden that these communities have been facing for generations and after generations. No words, no numerical models can grasp the atrocities committed against these communities. But why is it that in these research papers and these EJ analyses conducted at the federal and state levels, communities of color are constantly the subject of environmental justice analysis, when the work also ought to be done in the counterparts as well. I'm in the side of kind of wholeheartely welcoming the efforts to reduce burdens, but I believe that there are these to reduce burdens in a cross-cultural, multifaceted way, that's kind of the more effective and holistic approach to looking at environmental justice issues. Yeah.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
So,
please.
yeah, I'll add to that a little bit as well. As a government employee and in a conservation law enforcement career, minorities are definitely underrepresented in our branch of service. And when I was a military police officer, that military police corps also had some work to do as it relates to increasing diversity. And recently I was a part of the barrier analysis team within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as the Office of Law Enforcement representative. And for me, the data that was received that provided an overview of the demographics within our program was really telling. It was really telling. And I think that whereas the government organization that I work for has work to do in this area, I think the work is being done. Sometimes it's hard to really see it because it's on an incremental level, but programs like the barrier analysis team that searches for barriers in the workplace and provide recommendations to remedy those barriers, that's help. And then within our program, we have an outreach initiative where we're actually going to communities to provide outreach to get the word and get the message out about conservation careers. And I think that helps as well. I don't feel as though we're perfect. I definitely feel that there's room for improvement, but I know that those types of programs help to create more diversity within the organizations.
We actually have a question in the chat that kind of touches loosely on that. And the question is, how are the federal and state agencies, let's say governmental, because I realize that not all of us are in the States, breaking the status quo of having predominantly white males as administrators for natural resource agencies? Are we making headway there in your sense of things?
Yeah, that kind of dovetails into what I was saying. I mean, I feel, again, that there's work to be done. That for the first time, I was shocked by the numbers, and it's important that our organization reflects the American public that we serve. Now more than ever, I feel energized in the back half or back third of my career to dedicate time to increasing diversity within our organization. So I think that there are programs and there are working groups that are in place to help create a more diverse workforce. But again, there's work to be done. I don't want to sit on the panel and toot the horn as though we're perfect. There's still work to be done. And I feel getting the word out about our careers and letting young people know that these careers exist and they too can pursue these careers helps to create more diversity amongst our ranks.
So here's a question, and I'd like to kind of play with it a little bit before passing it to the panel, but how can educators at primarily white institutions invite people of color to be a part of environmental actions in our courses? I'm planning a social action course on environmental action in Baltimore, and I'm hoping to engage students of color at my institution in Baltimore City. So here's a thing that I have struggled with at Patuxent Riverkeeper, where we have tried to create the expectation amongst our members that a little bit of everyone is not only welcome, but likely to be at any of the events we're likely to hold. So if I have a jazz concert, frankly, mostly people of color show up, and whites complain. We've actually had complaints that we should have had a bluegrass concert. I know it sounds like a strange cliche because everyone listens to every kind of music. So I've come to the conclusion after having lots of events and seeing who shows up and who sticks around, you know, when whites leave early, and I've chased them down the road and said, why are you leaving? We'll all have such a great time. Well, we didn't think we were welcome. So when you change the dynamic where whites are in the minority, sometimes in these organizations, there's a little discomfort that the expectation, the norm has been that whites are in the majority and that we're playing to the musical choices or the cultural choices that are familiar in those communities. So now I think I have the point of view that while everyone is welcome, I don't know if I'll ever be able to have an event where everybody wants to participate because everything is not for everyone. But as long as that we've changed the expectation that not only is everyone welcome, but that people will think it's strange if they come to an event and it's all one ethnic group or one class or another. That's the culture change that I think we've tried to achieve at Patuxent Riverkeeper. Have others on this call struggled with that idea of trying to create an environment that is welcoming and embracing, so that if we extend an invitation, right, we have a party, and what happens if nobody comes?
I'd like to try and address sort of both the questions that have come up and sort of probably answer them in a broader way. In the UK, there have been recent efforts to recruit a more diverse workforce, which is very welcome, but it tends to be at the more junior level. Without having addressed some of the systemic issues within that organisation. So what you can then have are young people stepping into a dynamic which actually hasn't been explored around race. So sometimes I do think we need to be braver in acknowledging that there are systemic problems which aren't simply solved by recruiting more people in, that there should be space for us to have a conversation about some of the dynamics that have become generational and instituted. And that perhaps connects to the second question about how can we get Black people to come on our courses. And I think that's something we do encounter, certainly here, is a sense almost of a gatekeeping, of being invited into someone else's space or place. I run reflective groups called Reflections on Race, which offer environmental practitioners to come and have time around the fire and to talk about race and the dynamics, particularly within the environmental field, acknowledging the history of the movements, trying to make it a non-judgmental space to be honest about the kind of perceptions we have. Because when we discover that as individuals we have conscious or unconscious beliefs, we can understand how that starts to trickle into our messaging within our organisations and how we promote programmes and the signals that different people will pick up about whether it's a space where they'll be welcome. So there's something for me about gatekeeping and seeing this as sort of your space which you're inviting others to come into, and think about who, when we use the word our, who we're thinking are in that space and who it is we want to bring into that.
Understood.
For our, just to give maybe a conceptual idea for our outreach efforts, we're experimenting with a targeted approach within the Office of Law Enforcement. We created the National Outreach Working Group, which is comprised of individuals all over in all of the regions within OLE, so that we could take the outreach efforts to those areas. And the service also has the targeting recruitment team that has the same type of concept where they're targeting, they're being more intentional about the recruitment events and outreach events. They're targeting groups that where the Fish and Wildlife Service may be lacking representation. So I think for the example that you provided, Fred, maybe an option of taking the concert series to those communities that you're trying to reach, and allowing them to learn more about your organization, and therefore it may in return cause them to be more open to come to your facility. So maybe that's a strategy, you know, targeted approach that could help allow a certain level of comfort and relatability and, you know, just understanding with the organization, so that way they feel comfortable in joining in.
Yeah, I hear you. And a lot of our work is about community building. And so we have these concerts. They're really a means towards an end. The idea is to help build and create that community. And I've learned too that people who don't come from particularly diverse communities personally, I think struggle with that. That's why I think we've tried to change the expectations, right? I'd like it if people came to an event and it was all just white people there, they would think there was something odd about that. Actually, just like, you have an environmental picture, on the website of an environmental organization, right? And they've strategically placed, the people of color in various places in the picture to create the impression of, and I think, I'm like lots of people have become a master at kind of reading the body language in those pictures. Is this person really important based on where they've been placed strategically in the picture? What are they telling us? What is this picture telling us? So I think the picture telling story is one that applies to these organizations, and they gain a reputation sometimes. I mean, the idea of a Black Twitter, I think is really challenging for folks, but sometimes these organizations do have a reputation in Black and Brown communities that they may not be aware of, that more forthcoming conversations with communities that they interact with might yield some clues about what's going on in the DNA or the history or the behavior of that organization that causes the boycott that I referred to earlier. That it's not a reflection of a lack of interest in the conservation or the environment. I've never met anybody who wasn't interested in the quality of their own environment, right? It's actually more of a commentary on these clubs, institutions, organizations, and places where we don't necessarily feel as though we're important, where we're an afterthought, an asterisk, essentially. That would be kind of my take on it generally. I've got another question in the chat. I think this might be a typo, but it's even when agencies hire BIPOC and Hispanic Latino people, there's it says high retention problem. I think they mean low retention, I suspect. What can be done to change that? It's a big question. It's a big overarching kind of question, because I'm sure there's not one answer, right? There's not one magic bullet. There's no silver bullet. Anyone want to respond to that one?
I think for me, it comes back to an honesty in acknowledging that there are systemic issues, and diversity drives are great. It's great to create more jobs for a more diverse group of people. But we need to, alongside that, acknowledge that historically there have been problems, and to be brave enough to be able to talk about that, to have the conversation without feeling that we're troublemakers for doing so, which I'm sure many of us can relate to, that when you do speak up or try and point to particularly unhelpful dynamics, that you can be made to feel that you're creating a problem rather than simply notifying people of a problem.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
That's good. And I feel like the retention, it is a challenge, like you said, and it is a big question that, I think an analysis of your organizational culture is necessary to find out what challenges are in place, and hitting those challenges, and creating plans and strategies to remedy those challenges. Retention concerns could be for, cultural reasons. They could also be work-life balance challenges. It could be for a myriad of reasons, but I know that organizations, if they want to improve their retention, having that honest look at why those barriers exist, and creating plans and strategies to help better workplace is a way to improve those retention. I think also, we're examining mentoring programs within the organization to help allow retention levels to be improved, and pairing folks up and allowing them to learn more about the organization, and to have just a listening ear is helpful in them feeling welcomed and them feeling heard. So we're examining some different strategies on ways to improve retention.
An observation I've had is the kind of diversity, if we can use that term loosely, that you can hire is very different than the kind you need to inspire. That hiring diversity allows you to pick and choose, and inspiring it actually is a much broader field of having people engage with your organization. I think there's been a focus on hiring diversity that sometimes creates glass ceiling kinds of jobs. Like an urban outreach coordinator is a job description I've seen that's often applied in these organizations to people of color. I'm not sure if that's got much headroom in terms of promotion ability, right? Because if that person moves up in the organization, they have to go out and hire some more Black folks, which is odd to me as a definitional problem. I've struggled likewise with the idea that we're diversity, which seems to undersell what our potential is in these organizations. I think we're really stakeholders, not just diversity. Yeah, and mind you, I have a history before I was a waterkeeper of running for 9 years a business that was a minority certified government contractor, where tacitly there was an acknowledgement that we were, quote, disadvantaged in order to participate. So we came in under the flag of disadvantage and remedial treatment. And it was very difficult to find our way out of that again once we had been predefined. I kind of alluded to that in the earlier, in the introduction in the setup. So I think those are also problems, is that we can't always tell our own stories or name our own, define ourselves in these organizations. And so we'll split, we'll leave and go to places where we can be self-actualize. Maybe that's the best way to put it, to self-actualize. The actualization systems within these organizations are not built for us necessarily. They're largely built from a perspective that these are organizations that have a preference for, not openly discriminating necessarily, but a preference for whites. They're designed for, configured for. So that would be kind of my entry. I know I'm stepping out of the moderator role a little bit, but I have some lived experiences too that are very relevant to this. I have struggled to define my work quite apart from what at least some whites expect of me, because my heritage with the environment is very, very distinct and very different than people might expect. So it is a struggle. It is something that I think requires continuing conversation, but also continual effort to educate whites around us as to who we are, to the extent they want to hear our stories and take them up and make us integral parts of these organizations instead of afterthoughts. Hugely important. Beth? Yeah.
I think that a real struggle to be able to tell our stories and to work within our own perspectives, whether that's within a larger environmental organisation, which here are typically white middle class, or within smaller but emerging Black institutions, nature institutions, for example, like my own. One of the real problems we have is not that kind of, would not simply the interpersonal struggle to be heard. Whenever I walk into environmental spaces, I'm usually faced with a presumption of being less than. I will know less, I will be less experienced. I talk about it as the shadow of the environmental field, which often perceives itself to be very friendly and welcoming, but actually there's a shadow which projects quite a hostile sense that we don't belong, we're not as good, we're somehow out of place, or there's a disproportionate pressure to prove ourselves. Even in working in a Black-led organisation, that struggle manifests itself in being able to access funding in order to have our voice. It's a huge barrier. At the moment, people are saying, where are the Black voices? And we're saying we're here, but without funding, we can't self-actualize, we can't manifest. And the reason we're not getting funding are the same reasons why we meet the ceiling within an organisation, that there's a limited view of who we are and what we can achieve and what we can offer. That does need to be challenged, that there is a systemic issue, not just of the environmental organisations seeing us as a credible peer, but also funders and decision makers also seeing us as credible in this space.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I totally see that. Here's another question from the audience. This week there've been a lot of questions from colleagues about how to invite BIPOC folks into environmental courses and movements that are in primarily white spaces. It seems like we should be figuring out the best ways for white leaders to come into BIPOC movements and provide what those communities need. I realize there are also challenges with that process. Do panelists have thoughts? Wow, that's an interesting one. Huh. Wow. Any thoughts on that one? Anyone want to react to that?
No, the question provides great perspective, and it kind of goes back to what I was mentioning before, the need for, taking the fight to those that you're trying to reach. So, and taking the fight, it might be more military speak, but, you know, it's engaging with the communities that you're wanting to reach, you know, kind of what we were discussing earlier. And that targeted approach, it's not just like, it's not having a workshop and just, you know, waiting for people to, you know, join in on the workshop. It's going to them and saying, okay, maybe we're going to have a workshop in their community center or at their school. It's targeting and being intentional about the community you're trying to reach. So I think that's great perspective that question provides. And it would be a great suggestion for, you know, some of our leaders to go into those communities versus, you know, providing things and just waiting for those to just join in.
Understood. Anyone else want to tag on that? If not, I'll move on to another.
I can speak to it, but it's quite perhaps slightly different way. Again, being a Black-led organisation, what we're doing are training up people of colour as leaders in nature, because the feedback has been that people want to see people that look like them within an organisation to feel safe. So I wonder if there's a way of increasing Black leadership as a way of supporting a higher participation within other courses. Certainly the experience has been for us that when people have come and had a safe experience and been able to explore some of the issues that were barriers, they develop a stronger confidence to go off into the wider environmental field and enjoy different experiences there.
Yeah, understood. And incidentally, even in the movement that I'm a part of, the Waterkeeper movement, we've struggled with this on an international basis because we don't all come from the same religious backgrounds, don't have the same eating restrictions. When we have conferences that bring waterkeepers from all over the world, we still struggle with the presumption that we are an English-speaking, American-based, predominantly white movement that seeks to be global, and yet is still trying to find ways to do that better because the presumptions are still there. To me, that's a part of the decolonization conversation, right? If you're a colonizer, you get to name stuff, you get to define stuff, right? The need for self-definition is huge within communities that have those different lived experiences, and yet these movements are calibrated to really serve and accommodate the majority players who have the social range often enough to participate in these movements. If I can depart 1 second, I've struggled a lot this month with this idea of the difference between turf and domain. Turf being where you're standing, domain being where you can go. And we can go fewer places comfortably sometimes. In America, that's the case anyway, in terms of our safety, in terms of where we don't have to be very mindful that we're in a place where we're being closely observed and watched, as opposed to the turf that we own, which is where we're most comfortable. And so I think that this disconnect between turf and domain. Conversely, I do think that there are white organizations that believe that they can walk into anybody's turf and start telling people what to do about the environment and educating people off the bat. I don't know any Black or brown communities that have that perspective, that they can go into any community they wish, you know, that they have the domain to go wherever they want in order to pursue their environmentalism. So there's, I think built within that is a sense of respect and mindfulness about local knowledge and what people believe and what they understand about the environment, and not assuming from a colonial lens that we invented the environment or know everything there is to know about it and have the right to claim authorship or leadership wherever we happen to go because we're the prime environmentalists. That's a very different and very tacit, almost unconscious sensibility, I think. Would you agree or disagree?
Yeah, Fred, that comment, your comment reminds me of a conversation I had with a colleague of mine in preparation for this talk. And we were just discussing, you know, connecting with nature, and highlighted in our conversation was, you know, understanding that there is a rural urban divide, you know, of those who have the opportunity to travel out to nature safely and bond with nature versus those who did not. You know, there's Black individual, African-American individuals such as myself who have roots from the South. You know, my dad, who was from the South, perhaps had a more rural connection because of the environment that he grew up in, being out in the country, and the opportunities to connect with nature, you know, were there for him. And likewise, those values were poured into me. And my connection to nature was able to occur in a safe manner. Whereas there's other African Americans who, maybe from the North or grew up in, urban environments where they may not have had the opportunity because of, racism in certain areas, and they may not have had the opportunity to connect with nature because of their environment, and so therefore have become more detached to nature and in some ways robbed of the opportunity to connect to nature. So I think that part has to be acknowledged. And then looking in contrast to maybe an individual from a white European background who was able to just go out to nature without those challenges and connect with nature in a safe manner and bond with nature. So I think organizations and I think we just have to acknowledge that has occurred for some people, that those experiences are real and relevant. Also, I'm reminded kind of about a town hall, that we recently had with one of our senior leaders. I won't mention the name, but the conversation, centered around connecting with nature and how nature was a way of life and was a privilege. And the senior leader then said that they'd rather it not feel so privileged at times. And I just thought that was a powerful statement because nature is for everyone and the environment is for everyone and the opportunity should be there for everyone. So I just wanted to share that. It definitely reminded me of that conversation I had with my colleague when you made that statement.
I hear you. And by the way, one of the things that impressed me when I first met Lois, I think it was at the Smithsonian, was she pretty much said everything we're saying here in about 10 minutes flat in the short conversation we had after a speech that I gave. And it had never occurred to me that the Asian American female lived experience in environmental organizations was a different experience. That actually kind of rocked me on my heels. Like I'd never thought about it. Why would I? I mean, because it's not a lived experience that I'm familiar with. So that was a very valuable conversation, one of several that began to make me think more carefully about the concept of decolonization, because these are owned spaces or presumed to be, and thus we have to first acknowledge that's the case in order to unpack it. That's the process, that's the decolonization process. And that's a very distinct thing. When I started unpacking my own experience, I found that in my conservation work, I was an African American that largely served white communities, that I wasn't really a participant in the Black community. That actually was underselling the potential of Patuxent Riverkeeper. I've since done quite a lot in order to turn that around. And it turned out to be a real asset, that acknowledging my own Blackness in this work opened doors. It's a very different experience than at least some of my white colleagues could have done, to be honest. So that idea that it's not, I wouldn't say a demerit, the idea of being Black in these movements, but rather it's a departure from the norm. It's a novelty, as opposed to how do we normalize this so we have better movements, better places to experience stuff. We can talk about these ideas. One last thought on that too. I was sleeping on the Appalachian Trail in my sleeping bag and heard a bunch of white people talking about what people of color want in environmental movement. So I had to get out of the sleeping bag and join that conversation because I couldn't let that go down without adding my 2 cents. But it occurred to me that the most opinionated people in these conversations, typically about what people of color communities need and want, aren't always people of color. And that's a disparity that we need to challenge. We need to speak up and claim our own role in these conversations, say what we need and want, right? I think that's hugely important. Lois, you have a thought on that?
Yeah, first of all, thank you again and again for inviting me to this space. It's so wonderful. I can't imagine. Yeah, it's just wonderful. But also it's a privilege and an honor, and I thank you all. So as an Asian American, individual who respects and loves nature, I have had the privilege of serving as a fellow at EPA's Office of Environmental Justice. And I got to connect with other environmental justice activists like Charles Lee and Pietra Terrell. And so I got to kind of get a glimpse of what maybe our priorities were, or kind of what our understandings, the scope of kind of our interactions and understanding of the natural world was, just a glimpse from a kind of anecdotal perspective. And it's definitely, I'm just one person, Korean American, and I have a distinct narrative like everyone else. But my view is such that it's, so my parents were immigrants. We're trying to establish our home here. So we came here like in the late 80s, early 90s. So our experience of the natural world is just, we are foreigners. And even though Korean people have been here since 1903, there's this kind of ringing, like, I guess, there's this sense that that we are foreigners and we will always be foreigners. And yeah, that sounds very dramatic, but I feel like that sentiment it comes from the implications of some of the, you know, the executive orders that have been passed against Asian Americans in the US. And, you know, so since studying that from the mid 1800s against the Chinese populations, and along with other groups of Asian populations here in the US. So I think as just one Asian American activist in the environmental movement, I want, my goal is to just continue to connect with people, not people who are starting to realize what our Asian heritage means in the context of the US environment. And yeah, in an authentic and robust way, whatever that looks like. I mean, that's my goal. Everyone has different agendas, but yeah, that's just something I've come to realize, the need for community, the need for establishing what environment means for us, and working together as a result of those profound realizations as we take root in this country. Yeah.
If you forgive the quick very early in this work, I was paddling down the Patuxent River, not too far from where I live, and I encountered a family on the side of the river, on the banks of the river, fishing. There were a couple of kids, and I think the mother had like a tablecloth spread out on the grass, and they were just enjoying the sunshine and being next to the river. And I had a conversation, I think the family was from Guatemala, about kind of stewardship and the river and protecting the river and the pollution in the river. And the man of the family said to me, he said, "Senor, what is it exactly you think we can do? We just got here. We're immigrants. You all made this mess. You expect us to clean it up?" I thought, okay, that's an interesting take on this. That for the folks who are, I've actually met environmentalists who are anti-immigration because they believe that immigration influx of new people will bring fresh environmental problems. And I don't necessarily agree with that. I do think that the problems that we have environmentally, at least in my sphere, in Maryland, have largely been caused by the people who are already here. It ain't the newcomers, it's the folks here. But there is that perspective that's out there. It's like, well, these are folks who don't really care about the environment because. Again, that's that predefinition thing. These ideas that are out there, right, that the immigrant population is a burden rather than an asset. That's an odd concept for me to grapple with. But that guy put me in my place right off the bat. Like, what is it you think I can do, man? I've got no power, no money. You want me to clean up this river? Yeah, so anyway, for whatever it's worth.
You say,
Pardon me? Say again, Beth?
it is an odd, but sadly it's one that does have a legacy within the environmental movement, obviously, of certain people being not just polluting, but themselves a pollutant. And I think there are levels to which there is still a colonial lens which views some people as being out of place or themselves a threat to nature, which also governs how welcome and safe people feel, but also that white lens, how others are being perceived.
Yes, and that goes to one of the questions in the chat. I'd love to hear the panelist's perspective on the title of this panel. Are we aiming to break the hold of decolonization on the environment, or decolonize it, or both? Because, and I think behind that question is the underlying idea of what decolonization, what colonization is, right? It is an occupation of sorts. It's a claiming of space. It's a presumption, either that one was here first or the one has more power. So where does this conversation, I guess, settle on the question of either decolonizing these movements or decolonizing the environment? They're really two different ideas, I suspect. You want to have a take on that?
For me, it would be both. That there are the environmental movements which perhaps take it upon themselves that they are the proper custodians, and they perhaps own land or the access to the land. But then there is also the internalization that a lot of people of colour have, these internalized myths about where we belong. So it's decolonizing our own minds and knowing that these spaces are for us too. We're entitled to be in them, we're entitled to participate. So I think that there's something about both making environmental movements more equal and just, but also increasing access to land and psychologically making sure everyone feels they don't just have the physical access, but psychologically have a sense of belonging and entitlement to be there too.
I would agree. I would say that the decolonization conversation is a different conversation from justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. It's a slightly different conversation. The decolonization conversation allows us to get to the heart of what is in the DNA of these organizations that makes them off-putting and difficult for people of color to invest our time and energy in, to express ourselves in. Whereas the Jedi experience is, granted, I'm not sure it's a head count as much as it's maybe a measuring stick to determine how successful we have been at decolonizing. I'm shooting from the hip here, but that's something I think I'm gleaning from this conversation. Let's see how we're doing on our questions here. Here's one aimed at me. Given my background in media, do you have ideas to share about strategies for changing the narrative, supporting people and telling their own stories in impactful ways? I've also learned that people tell their stories however they tell them. It doesn't have to be on videotape or on an audio tape, or that the stories that people have to share, actually it's a form of flattery. When people entrust their stories to you, I have learned to take that that's very special, right? People trust you enough to endow you with their stories. That's saying something about their acceptance of you, I think. And so I've tried to be a good custodian of as many stories as possible on the Patuxent River as people can tell me. Some of those stories are probably true, actually. But I respect the stories nonetheless, because I think through storytelling, people do tell you, they reveal themselves. People care enough to want to reveal themselves to you. That's a special gift. I think gifts is also one of the themes of today's conference. Do we bring gifts? The gifts we bring are the stories that we have to share, which are illuminating. Yes,
I like your response to that, about others sharing their stories with you. When I was serving at the International Law Enforcement Training Academy in Botswana, the purpose of that training was to, share our tactics and our concepts with a lot of the law enforcement organizations throughout the continent. They were represented from rangers to prosecutors, and it was a really enjoyable time. But it's so interesting that, even though we were there to teach, we learned so much from their stories and from their experiences, and hearing the challenges that they face when in doing that conservation law enforcement work. So I agree, it is something special when others share their stories with you in the way that they are most comfortable, and that for me is impactful.
And if I could chime in, through the art of storytelling, whether it was oral or through books that I read, that I've benefited from other great thinkers and activists, I've realized that kind of self-actualization, the narrative I tell for myself today, it's a practice, and it's something that I need to come to face with every day, and realize our narrative that I tell about myself is through a multifaceted lens, kind of like, look, since we carry a set of identities, not just my gender, but also my race and things like that, it affects how I perceive other individuals who might carry this similar set of identities, and as a result, a community of people that kind of look like me. So I hope that as my Asian American environmental activist community take root in this country, that will continue to tell our narratives in a positive light, in a critical lens, but in a positive light as well. Acknowledging the forces of colonialism in our spaces, but first recognizing the powers that we hold because of our heritage and our experiences.
So we're actually at a point in our conversation for final thoughts. And those sound a little final, but if someone wants a little more space to share a parting thought, then this would be the time to do it. I think this, like I said, was a difficult conversation to form and structure, particularly over the geography. But I think we got a chance to unpack some ideas that are inherent in any movement, club, organization that wants to be embracing of any and all comers. I think we've kind of teased out at least some of those ideas. And help me out here, they actually have to expunge that which lives within the organization that is off-putting to people of color, which requires a deeper look. You're not going to find a silver bullet answer to that. I guess 2 is creating space where people can tell their stories. I have observed that we tell very different stories amongst ourselves than we might tell in a mixed group, and that cuts both ways. And so I've tried to mentor as many conversations as people are able and want to have by creating that safe space. And so if there are no reprisals in these organizations for us saying what we think, being who we are, and telling those stories, that's a step in the right direction, I would suppose. Any other checklist of or parting thoughts that people could take home from this conversation in their own analysis of the decolonization in the groups that they're connected to?
I agree and build on what you've just shared, and I think sometimes we do have to be brave and acknowledge sometimes these issues are relational, and we can take ownership for what we contribute to conversations and dynamics within our own environmental spaces. And to be brave enough to acknowledge that systems also exist which can create a different experience for different groups. So as much as it's great to look at diversity drives, how we include other people, I think we do have to take the time to see what's already here that isn't quite working and to be able to acknowledge that.
Fantastic.